Here is a blue ink by Diamine Arctic Blue. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
When I ordered this, I didn't realize it was a shimmering ink, but I like shimmer inks, so let's do this. There's a bunch of tone variation by nib, like every nib, and there is often shading. Now the shimmer is minimal and just enough to know it's there. So if you wanted less shimmer, I really like this for its very light use of it. Now on non-fountain pen friendly paper, it performed just fine, but as would be expected, the shimmer gets lost. So this was a fun surprise, but while I enjoy shimmer inks, I have a limited need for them. I do use them just because they're fun, but there's only so many bottles of shimmer ink that one person needs. So with that, it's great for a sample. Love it. Bottle, I don't think this is one I would seek out a bottle for. Not out of anything bad though. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib that writes rather dry. A Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet. A Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow. A Lamy All-Star with a broad nib that writes average.
The pen for today is a Platinum 3776.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the lightest tone that we're gonna get, and it is a very nice blue. No feathering, no spread, not a surprise with it being Clairfontaine. It shades pretty well, and I doubt it's really gonna come through on camera, but in those darker areas of shading, you are getting some shimmer, which adds a little bit of that sparkle to it, a little something extra, comes across very nicely. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is way darker than it was with the soft fine. It's by far the darkest tone that we get with this ink. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade much less. When you look at water on the first line compared to among underneath it, very different in tones. And the next to that starts lighter and works its way darker in the he, where many, the A and the Y, the A is a little darker than the M and N. The Y is much darker during that down loop. Yes, the shimmer comes through very well here, comes through much stronger here than it does on the other nibs, but I think it's because it's just such a wet pen. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade fairly nicely in what's going on. Not a ton of it, but it's definitely there. Look at and on the second line. The A is darker than the N and the D gets much darker again. That underneath it starts lighter on the T. The HA get very dark, lighting again on the T at the end. Is next to that very dark, and left next to that to the right is a little bit darker and shows some shading. The shimmer does come through in the darker areas of the writing, and in certain ways I wish I could control where shimmer went because I think it would look neat in the lighter areas. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, a little bit darker than it was with the soft fine. Now it doesn't feather and it doesn't spread, and if you look at the top lines, it looks like it's having a hell of a problem. There was a fiber in the nib that I wound up cleaning out, and during that second line after I scratched out the one word, you start seeing it writing normal. No feather, no spread, shades not as well as it did with the other pens. Shimmer does come through a little bit in a fairly uniform fashion, which is very nice that it's almost always present, but ever so slight in what it's doing. It's very well done. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here's the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There was approximately 13 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, I think, a little bit better than it did on the Clairfontaine. The absorbent nature of this paper compared to the coated Clairfontaine is really helping it out here. Now the shimmer is not coming through. Not at all. It gets eaten up by this paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade. Take a look at Dragon on the first line or the second line. Starts much darker on the DR, lightens a little bit on the AG, lightens a little bit more with the on at the end. Shimmer, not here. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, but just by a smidgen. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade a little bit better again than it did on the Clairfontaine. It's surprising that it's really doing that so well. Look at went on the second line. The W is a little bit darker than the EN, and the T gets very dark at the end. Gate on the first line starts lighter with the GA. The TE at the end, very dark. Still no shimmer. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, just a tad bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Look at the dark on the third line. The T of the starts lighter than the he that it ends with, and the D and K of dark are darker than the R, AR in the middle. Still here, no shimmer. Looking at the back of the page, we see no bleeding, no ghosting, and that we can easily take our notes on backs as well. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, but we're getting a little bit of a kind of greenish turquoise look out of the ink. An effect of the paper showing this ink is a little bit translucent. Now it's not feathering and it's not spreading, it is shading very well. Take a look at wall on the first line, where the WA start lighter and the LL get darker. Between, right next to that, the BE is lighter than the TWE that get darker. The last EN get just a little bit darker than that. Shimmer, not coming through on this non-fountain pen friendly paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. I'm not really seeing that kind of greenish hue that the soft fine had on this paper. I think it's being wetter, let it put down that much more ink, not a surprise there, but it maintained the blue. Now, no feathering and no spreading. The shading is non-existent here, as is the shimmer. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Little bit of that green hue coming through with it. It's not bad looking. It does have tiny bits of feathering on the left side. The only on the first line, I can see it a little bit. It's not distracting. It's not really a problem. I see it on stony water on the second line, harsh on the third. So it's there quite often, but it's not distracting from the writing. You know, no spread. Shading, only tiny bits, only the occasional spot of some darker areas. Other than that, it's fairly uniform in tone. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, definitely showing some of that green hue. It does feather about like it did with the medium, tiny little feathers. Every now and then it can be found. Don't be surprised if you look at don't on the third line where you see tiny little feathers at the bottom of the N and T. Now it doesn't spread. It does have tiny bits of shading like the word like on the third line where the LI is lighter than the KE at the end, but this shading here is not a standout feature, much like the shimmer that we're not seeing. Looking at the back of the page, it's interesting because the broad and the medium, the ink got very deep into this paper, and that's where feathering also was spotted on the other side. Now, the soft fine and the wet fine didn't have that problem. Those you could easily write on the back of the page, but the medium and the broad, not so much, but nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does have some shading about as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. I do see the shimmer coming through very lightly as I'm writing with it. Again, I'm doubting it's coming through on camera. It does stand out against the quad rule, which is a good reason to be using it here to see how well it does. I think it stands on its own, no problem. I'm not seeing those vertical lines as I'm looking at this. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the wet fine, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade better than it did on the Clairfontaine, no doubt about that. Take a look at doubt on the second line where the D is very dark and the OUB lighten up quite a bit into that T that darkens a lot at the end. The shading is very nice. Shimmer is coming through and doing a great job. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade, not huge, but it is very noticeable when it's there. Still on the second line is much darker than mountain on the first line above it, and the to the left of that starts a little bit lighter with the T, darkens up quite a bit with the he. Now these darker areas tend to carry more of the shimmer, which is coming through in the writing. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade about as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, which was not huge in what's happening, but it's there. I would mostly treat this like I was getting a uniform tone from the broad. Not bad at all, really. Now, as far as the shimmer, there and fairly uniformly shared throughout the writing. So the lack of shading gets made up for with how well the shimmer is behaving here, because often it likes to pool in certain areas of letters. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. We can easily continue our notes back here.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Ackerman, Delft's Blow.
Here is Blackstone Sydney Harbor Blue. Here is Diamine Skull and Roses. Here is Noodler's Bernanke Blue.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, It is lighter and duller than it was on the Clairfontaine. Little bit of a blue turquoise look to it. Not the same blue as a tone of ink. It's like a very blue leaning turquoise, where on the Clairfontaine it looks blue. No feathering, no spread. Shading is doing a great job. Look at only in June they on the second line. Only starts as a lighter tone. It darkens up a little bit at the Y. In is a nice lighter tone throughout. June, the beginning of the J is lighter. That downstroke really did darken up quite a bit. The UN lighten up a little bit. The E quite a bit darker. And the they, T is lighter than hey at the end. Shimmer? No. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does not shade, it does not shimmer. It's the knot. However, it still looks good. It still stands out on this quad rule. It's not a problem. It's a knot. Not a problem in any way. If this was in your pen and when you went to take your notes, it wouldn't be a problem, just not getting the pizzazz into your notes. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine. Little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does have little bits of shading that are going on. Not a huge standout feature. Not strange when we look at this. Look at strange on the third line, where it's the E at the end that is much darker than the rest of the word. It's there. It can be had, like had on the second line, where the H and the D are darker than the A in the middle. Now shimmer, still not here. Not that I was expecting it at all. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does not shade. It does not shimmer. It's a knot, but it is performing very well, so I can't complain at all about it. I don't expect shimmer to come through on the non-fountain pen friendly papers. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Pilot 100th Anniversary Pink. Here is Organic Studios F. Scott Fitzgerald Golden Orange. Here is Diamine Deep Magenta. Here is Sailor Kobe number 21.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it's just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather and it does spread it. There are a couple moments of shading. There is no shading, or sorry, shimmer. I think the feathering that's going on is a manageable situation here. Don't worry, it's going to get worse. But the feathering is really under control from this dry pen. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. Lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather like a monster covered in feathers. It does spread up past the medium. It does have shading. I guess we could call that a positive there. It does not shade. It does not belong being used from a wet fine nib on this paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It feathers, it spreads, it doesn't shade, it doesn't shimmer. It's really distracting to look at. It's mesmerizing, but it's not the worst I've seen in it. It's just bad. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was from the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, it does spread, it doesn't shade. It is a nice uniform tone. Of course, it doesn't have shimmer. The only thing I saw really usable here was with the soft fine, that very dry fine nib. Other than that, this is ugly. Looking at the back of the page, you can see just how deep this ink really was getting into the paper. All over the place, not nearly as much with the soft fine, which was the one that was most usable on the front of the page. Now, as much as you could not write back here because you would destroy both sides of notes, it did not bleed through and touch the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The soft fine is the lightest tone. It shades well and can even show shimmer from this dry pen. Now, the wet fine was the darkest shade the darkest tone and shaded the least and showed the most shimmer. The medium had a good mid-tone with a decent amount of shading, and of course, it did let that shimmer come through. The broad was darker than the soft fine, but nowhere near as dark as the medium. It shaded the least, and it did show shimmer in that nice uniform way, which was very pleasant to see. Now, it's the tone from the medium nib and that perfect showing of shimmer in all of that darkest writing that would make me choose it. In fact, I switched pens during this segment, the nib and pen, to the medium nib because I wanted to see it some more. So it's that nib that really made this pop to me and be at its best.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.